You let me know.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to start the second session on curriculum analysis. So our resource person, Professor Poonam Batra, is with us right now. And we are going to start the session now. Ma'am, over to you now.
Okay. I will leave the video off.
Okay, ma'am.
There's a lot of echoing happening.
Yes, yes.
I'm not sure. So shall we have everybody mute, please?
Yes, all are muted.
I think there is still some echoing, no? And now it's okay. Can you hear me properly now?
Yes, ma'am, I can hear you properly.
Okay, so I'm going to keep the video off.
Okay.
Okay. So we had spoken about looking at curriculum and curriculum design, curriculum issues in the larger context of a socio-historic perspective, as well as in the immediate perspective of the pandemic and what it has thrown up. So we did understand that ultimately, despite the anti-colonial perspective during the freedom struggle and the attempt of many nationalist leaders such as Gandhi, Tagore, Sri Aurobindo and others, we were not able to release our education system post-independence India from the colonial shackles. So that is what I am calling the modernist universalist frame of curriculum, which is very much bound within the colonial frame. And of course, there was a question as to how we can release ourselves from this frame. And hopefully we will attempt to answer that question as I move on today, and then we'll have a discussion. So I'm going to now begin the second session, looking at how modernity itself, which is what we sort of took from the colonial rule and made it our own in a sense. But modernity is not peculiar to India. This is a concept that everybody across the world, critical scholars, are sort of revisiting, rethinking whether this frame of development and civilization is itself a problem. And when we look at the design of school curriculum or higher education curriculum, I think we cannot escape the importance of looking at these debates as to what modernity is really showing us today, what are the kind of problems it is throwing up, which we have seen especially during the pandemic. So, in a sense, I would like to say what many other critical scholars are saying, that the pandemic has demolished the popular perceptions of modernity. What are the popular perceptions of modernity? One is the notion of human supremacy over nature, that we have control, we have conquered nature, and we have controlled nature to the benefit of human civilization. As I had mentioned in my morning session, that to look at the human being at the center of the universe is itself a problem, which is what is called the anthropocentric view. So modernity itself is being questioned, saying that perhaps modernity itself has actually given us this false notion that the human being is supreme and is superior to nature, and the belief that the human being, the human race, has the power to predict, to control, and to establish order. So this truth, in a sense, has been thrown up by the pandemic. Scholars have also said that the very story of the self, which is in modernity, is the story that a separate individual exists in the world of the other. That means we have made our civilization so much focused on the individual self that we feel that the individual is a different world related to the other. And the individual has now got obsessed with money, with property, with all kinds of material benefits, which actually expresses the delusion that the self, which is actually impermanent, can be made permanent. That means if we have enough money, if we have enough convenience, if we have enough material benefits, and we make our lives convenient because of these material benefits, then we can make the self also a permanent entity. But that is not true, because the self is transient. It's not permanent. It gives us the illusion of being permanent. So Avijit Pathak, one of the critical scholars who's written around the question of modernity and questioning it during the pandemic, says that we should take this opportunity of the pandemic having come to become more reflexive, to become perceptive, and to gather the courage to confront new questions. What are the new questions? The new question would be, how do we unlearn modernity in search for a new world? And I think this becomes a very critical question for curriculum developers, for educators. We should revisit curriculum with these questions, because the modernist universalist frame of curriculum has been something that we have all eulogized and adopted. So that is why it's important to look at this question again. So the question can move further into asking that, can this pandemic, which has thrown us completely off gear for the past 1.5 years, can it force us, compel us to develop a movement towards greater economic, social, gender, and environmental justice? And how do we create a socially just and a compassionate society? How do we create a society that was envisaged by Jyotiba Phule, Savitribai Phule, by John Dewey, by Ambedkar, where attitudes of respect and reverence are towards everybody? That is, to live according to the principles that Dewey defines in his philosophy of democracy and education, saying that of associated living. And what are these epistemologies that can support such a change? How do we develop and design curriculum that can help us make this transformation? So I think one of the key things that we need to look at is that we need to revisit the human capital approach. Because the human capital approach, where we look at curriculum as something that should be designed to develop human resource, human capital, in order to increase economic growth and global competitiveness. Now, this is a very instrumental aim of education. It is an aim of education that focuses on developing skills and competencies. That's why our whole discourse is around that. Even the NEP 2020 is talking of developing skills and competencies and outcome-based higher education. But in this whole noise of focusing only on skills and competencies, we are focusing on outcomes and we are forgetting the processes of knowledge generation itself. We are trying to believe that output of knowledge, output of education is important, but what happens inside classrooms and what kind of knowledges should we engage with and how we need to bring in the subjective into the curriculum discourse, we have forgotten. And I think that is what we need to drive our attention towards, which means that we need to look at what kind of knowledges are being disseminated and what kind of knowledges are being suppressed. Which knowledge has a premium and why? And how is the power of reason being undermined in preference for popular identities and desires? So, for example, today, the most important question that the politicians seem to be disseminating amongst the normal sort of citizenry is that your identity is more important. And that's why they are polarizing identities. They're trying to pitch one community against the other and make them fight. But is this really what we want to do with ourselves? They are taking away the power of reason from us. And the power of reason is something that will help us to get out of polarization and to live in a more cohesive, harmonious manner. And this is possible only if we are able to bring in the right kind of knowledges and learning processes through the curriculum that we design and select for our different higher education courses. So the question therefore is, if we want to design a curriculum that can bring about a socially and environmentally just and a connected world, then we have to ask the question, which knowledge is suppressed, which knowledge should be disseminated, which knowledges seem to carry greater premium, and how do we develop the power of reason and scientific temper. Now, scientific temper is something that is called the Nehruvian project, because that is what our first Prime Minister focused on, that we need to develop amongst our people a scientific way of thinking. And science doesn't mean only the science that happens inside laboratories, but that social science is also a science that helps us to differentiate between opinion and reason and a fact. And I think education can do that. And for that, we have to come back to the question of curriculum. So what are the two important questions when we engage with design of curriculum? The two important questions are, one is the epistemological frame, that is knowledge itself. What do we choose? What do we take as knowledge which is legitimate? And second is the ontological question. Ontological question is the reality around us. That means we have to bring the knowledge frame and the ground reality together. And only then will we be able to engage with issues of social inequality, economic inequality, educational inequality, and the structural contradictions of the Anthropocene. So if we want to achieve social equality and environmental justice, then education content, which is curriculum, and education process, which is pedagogy, both will have to be egalitarian and emancipatory. Education in India and all over the global south needs to become a means to interrogate domination and exploitation. That means our curriculums should be designed in such a way that we interrogate, that we question domination and exploitation. And we also develop an inner resilience and a sense of social justice. But the Eurocentric universalism, which is embedded inside modernity, is therefore needs to be questioned, because critical scholars are today saying we don't live in a universal world, we live in a pluriverse world, a world which has plurality, not only in terms of tradition, language, religion, classes, etc., but we also have a pluriverse in terms of biodiversity, in terms of species, in terms of the plants and the animals that are in this world. So we have seen in the past that actually social and environmental movements and the construction of anti-colonial national imaginaries are very good frames for us to reimagine curriculum. For example, we have to get out of the behavioristic scientific movements of curriculum that I talked about in the first session, where knowledge is only looked at from an objectivity point of view. And also, when we reimagine curriculum, we have to reimagine it to ask a very basic question that Spencer asked in the year 1884. And that question is, what knowledge is most worth teaching? And I think we have to revisit this question in the current context. So debates around educational access and educational process and justice are more than a century old in India, because these debates have been happening since the 19th century with the struggles of feminist and anti-caste writings. For example, Jyotiba Phule, Savitribai Phule, Tarabai Shinde, Pandita Ramabai, Rokhaya Begum, Fatima Sheikh. There are several examples. And this discourse of the anti-caste struggle and women's liberation, this discourse rests on ideas of transformative education. This discourse can help us to actually overthrow the forces that subjugate both women and Dalits. For example, there's a beautiful play that Jyotiba Phule wrote way back in the 19th century called Tritiya Ratna. Tritiya Ratna means the third eye. And this play was written basically to show the possibilities of how through education we can enable those who are oppressed to understand their oppression and to transform the relationship between power and knowledge. We need to come back to those ideas which have been very much part of India's history. So the anti-caste discourses, unfortunately, were kept out of the nationalist discourse that created the anti-colonial discourse. So the Western forms of knowledge continued, even though we were able to fight for a free India. So when Gandhi aimed to make curriculum democratically accessible by making it socially, culturally, economically relevant, still, because of the exclusion of the anti-caste discourse in the curriculum, we were not able to take these ideas forward. And therefore, the idea of Gandhi or Tagore or Shri Aurobindo, which was to make curriculum socially, culturally, economically relevant, it did not connect with the idea that Ambedkar put forth to create a caste-free India. So curriculum was envisioned as a process of students' engagement with nature, self, and social milieu, but it did not confront the caste and the gender-based fault lines of Indian society. And this is the epistemic link which failed to get established between Gandhian, Tagorean, Shri Aurobindian thought and Ambedkar's thought of how education and curriculum can help us to develop a caste-free and a non-hierarchical, more egalitarian society. This is the epistemic link that did not get established, which I think today we have another opportunity to try and create. Because Ambedkar's ideology of liberation was actually an ideology that came not only from the thoughts of Gautam Buddha, Mahatma Phule, Kabir, but also from the Enlightenment philosophy and his own political struggles. Because we know that Ambedkar fought against the discrimination against himself. And therefore, for him, equality was the overriding principle. So his socio-political thought is actually rooted in social democratic liberalism, wherein criticality is accorded a synthesis between individuals, community, and society. And curriculum has to address was very deeply influenced by Dewey, and he studied with Dewey in Teachers College in Columbia in New York, because for him democracy was a form of associated living. That's where the ideas come of equality, fraternity, and mutual respect for each other, which we find in our constitution. So the 20th century anti-colonial struggle for India's independence did not make any real epistemic connection with the anti-caste discourse. And that is why the modern education system that we inherited and we continued till today is a system that basically continues hierarchical and hegemonic character of the Brahmanical power, which is central. So with this colonial feudal nexus, the most privileged people, that is the upper caste, have got the maximum benefits out of the modern system of education. And therefore, it is important for us to remind ourselves of what J.P. Naik said later in his last book in 1982, when he says that we need to link the idea of quality education with equity and justice. We cannot talk of quality only in terms of learning outcomes. We have to see whether the educational process itself, when the teacher-students interact in an institution, in a classroom, in a higher education college, then those processes have to be democratic, and they have to give enough opportunity for the most disadvantaged also to be able to develop themselves. Both Phule and Ambedkar underlined the importance of situated knowledge. For them, knowledge is not disconnected from the context. It is situated. And it is important that curriculum is designed according to this idea of situated knowledge. So for both of them, the democratization of the method of knowledge includes the integration of the principles of what Sharmila Rege calls prajna, that is critical understanding, the principle of karuna, that is empathic love, and the principle of samta, which is equality. So if we want to develop a curriculum that is emancipatory and a pedagogy that is emancipatory, then we have to include the three principles of prajna, karuna, and samta, which is critical understanding, empathic love, and equality. When we integrate these principles, that is when Sharmila Rege calls it a feminist movement, and she titles a very interesting paper in EPW which says Phule Ambedkarite Feminist Pedagogies, and she offers the critical space for generating new knowledge. The idea being that we need to bring in the stories of the students themselves. What are the lived realities of the students? Those have to be brought into the curriculum discourse in the classroom. And that is when curriculum becomes a deliberative exercise. As many other scholars, including Michael Apple, Henry Giro, and Kincheloe have pointed out, that when curriculum is devoid of conflict, that itself means that we are creating students who are apolitical, who don't have a sense of agency. That means you have to bring conflict inside the curriculum. And another scholar, Paraskeva, argues that conflicts need to be seen as a fundamental element of a social transformation network. So we need to design curriculum in such a way that conflict is part of the discourse and the engagement, because only when we see conflict, that is when we are able to move beyond it towards social transformation. And if any of you remember reading Paulo Freire also in his Brazil work talks about how to create conscientization amongst the oppressed so that they can see what conflict it produces and how to go beyond that to achieve a more egalitarian society for themselves. So one of the critical arguments that Michael Apple talks of is that maybe we should look at non-Western knowledges or non-Northern theories and philosophies. That could be one starting point. But then very quickly, scholars realize that there is no such thing as non-Western or as non-Northern or just Southern-led. Yes, of course, we need to look at our own Southern countries and Southern-led research, but that is not enough, because even in the Southern countries, we have exploitation, unequal power relationships, and inequality, which have to be brought into the curriculum discourse. So what does Sharmila Rege offer us? She offers us a very interesting way to develop curriculum and pedagogy. And before I go into what she has to tell us, I'd like to emphasize one more aspect, and which is that when we look at curriculum as a concept, we should not look at curriculum only as a matter of subject matter inside a textbook, as if curriculum is only that content. Actually, curriculum is something lived. Curriculum is what transpires inside the classroom. Curriculum is not just matter inside the textbook. It is what meaning making happens inside the classroom as students engage with the faculty and with each other in constructing meaning. Now, if we look at the definition of curriculum in this broad sense, then it becomes important to understand what Sharmila Rege is trying to tell us. She's saying that because we have persistently excluded the experience of caste and the lived realities of diversity and marginalization in our curriculum, and we have focused only on universalistic nature of curriculum, this is the reason why we have not been able to develop a curriculum that resonates with our own context. So she says that gender and caste, for example, have been typically absent categories of analysis in mainstream disciplines. So when we study and teach sociology, we teach it from the Western theoretical frames which do not talk of caste, or we teach from very male perspectives in which gender is not a question. Now, even when we talk about gender, we cannot only rely on theories that come from the Western context, let's say theories of liberal feminism or social feminism or radical feminist theory. We also need to bring in the perspective that emerges from our own context. For example, the theory of Brahmanical patriarchy that helps us understand that gender and caste are deeply interconnected, and caste is sustained because of women, because of gender, because we have caste women inside the caste category so that they cannot marry outside the caste. And that is how caste is maintained. And this is the first insight that Ambedkar himself gave us when he wrote the essay called Annihilation of Caste. And I think the first feminist theory of Brahmanical patriarchy came from that essay. We need to read more to understand that. So Rege makes a plea that we need to bring in social narratives, lived experiences, and voices of our students who are living on the margins, whether because of caste, because of gender, because of class, because of language or ethnicity. When we bring such narratives inside the classroom, we can see how they are related to each other and how caste, class, gender, ethnicity intersect to create all kinds of lived experiences. That is when the curriculum becomes a deliberative exercise. And then the curriculum enables dialogue around intersectionality, around the social tensions, which help us to constructively critique the dominant epistemological positions, the dominant disciplines. And these curriculum materials will have to be outside textbooks, include poetry, include music, include resistance music, include biographies, and include Dalit testimonies. That is what the suggestions are. So when Rege argues, she says, let Dalit studies become a pedagogic practice, because that explains the particularity of the nature of the Dalit discourse, which a Brahmanical perspective cannot bring. Only a Dalit perspective can bring. But that doesn't mean that only Dalits look after Dalits. It only means that all of us try and bring in these subaltern discourses so that we can understand the logic of exclusion, which is embedded in binaries. So the feminist or the Dalit standpoint is a collective subject position. And she says that offers us a critical curriculum frame of reference to counter the dominant curriculum narratives, which only focus on the individual, not on the social, and only towards developing human capital and not developing critical citizens. So a situated curriculum becomes not only the means to interrogate domination and exploitation in society, but it also becomes a means to develop inner resilience. Right? Shall I continue?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, of course.
Okay. So now I think we should be at a point where we can say with confidence that we need to revisit our thinkers who tried to transform our society. For example, John Dewey, when he talks of how schools are also like miniature societies because we have to develop a democratic way of living. And Dewey's work is very well known. But even though Dewey brought the academic and the public universes closer, what was important is to understand that the hierarchies of knowledge will also have to be questioned in a formal curriculum, which means what I said earlier, which knowledge do we include? Why are we excluding some other knowledges? So for example, have we ever thought in higher education or even in school education why we have never taught Ambedkar as a political philosopher? We have only talked of Ambedkar as the architect of the Indian Constitution. But there is a political philosophy. Remember, Ambedkar had 2 PhDs in economics and in philosophy. And his work is now being sought after by all critical scholars across America and several other countries. But in India, we have never taught Ambedkar. And I think that is what I mean when I say that why have we left some knowledges out of our system? And if we redesign curriculum, we need to bring these knowledges back. So one of the critical things that Ambedkar tried to do during his time was that education is not only inside the classroom. Education is also public in nature. So for example, he believed in organizing mass mass sort of public sabhas and talking to people, ordinary common people on the roads in mass public meetings, because he felt that intellectuals need to relate to common people and to take that complex knowledges to them in simple ways. And Ambedkar was like Gramsci, who believed that education was a critical social activity because it had the broader network of experience, of history, and of collective struggle. So curriculum is an important part of society at a particular moment in history. So you can't say that there is a general curriculum principle. You can design curriculum today or 10 years later following the same principles, because curriculum is about situated knowledge. It's about a particular time in history. And therefore, today is a time again when the pandemic has shown us the ugliness of inequality that strikes our society, our civilization all over the world, and particularly in India with our already social hierarchies. It is time that we look at curriculum as part of a society in our moment today, and we should imbue it, we should enmesh it with cultural, social, and historical meaning. It is this flexibility that will allow curriculum to become both a tool of social dialogue and a means of adapting educational systems to dynamic societies, because societies change. Societies are not static, they keep changing. And today we notice that actually societies are not only changing, they are changing rapidly because of the toxic political environment that is forcing ordinary people to look at their own diversity in very different ways. I had never heard that a Sikh community actually talks about anti-Muslim like it happened in Kashmir, but that was politically motivated. So this is what I'm trying to say, that right now, when the political environment is creating divisions in society and trying to divide us on the basis of religion and caste, us as educators have to be very careful and design our curriculum in such a way that we can counter this political discourse and create the basic aim of education being to create a coherent, cohesive, harmonious society. And we cannot lose sight of that. And therefore, our curriculum exercise will have to include these elements so that we can select curriculum content appropriately and help our young people to realize that WhatsApp University is not a university to study from, that we cannot base our understanding on the basis of WhatsApp messages where there is a deliberate attempt to distort history every day since the past 7 years. And that critical pedagogic communication is necessary to ensure that our young people engage with social diversity, multiple perspectives, only by understanding their own and others' positions in society. And this is possible only when the education process is designed to be that of dialogue between teacher, students, and among students, so that we can help students to think and to reflect from several perspectives as they engage, which also means that we will have to break the hierarchy between the teacher and the students. We cannot treat the students as if they are to be suppressed. And in this online learning, unfortunately, whatever emancipatory curriculum you may have, but when you're teaching online, the teacher has the power to mute anybody in class and stop somebody from asking real questions. And therefore, there is the danger of becoming judgmental and not judging your professional role as a teacher, and to encourage a sense of empathy and critical thinking. So we have to think about all these matters as curricular and pedagogic issues which are woven together. So teaching, studying, understanding, and coping with alterity. Alterity is an interesting term that helps us understand our relationship with the other. And I think curriculum has to be designed in a manner that helps us to relate to the other. We cannot only design curriculum for individual gain, individual mental development, individual getting marks, individual climbing up the ladder. But we need to design curriculum where there is respect for all and we learn to listen to the other. Alterity is therefore particularly important in enabling young people to understand diversity and to appreciate difference and not to hierarchize it, because difference does not mean deficit. Difference means difference. We don't have to say one difference is higher than the other. We cannot create hierarchies, but a more egalitarian way of looking at each other. So it is important that we enable educational content and design to be egalitarian, emancipatory. For this, we will have to problematize social, economic, environmental, political inequality. We will have to question that. And there is also need to develop an international discourse around the need to reject learning systems that alienate individuals and social practices that dehumanize people. For example, just today I'm reading in the newspapers that 60% of students who drop out from IITs, and the highest number is in Guwahati, the 60% people of students of IITs in the country that drop out are from SC, ST categories, which means that we are not giving them a comfortable space to learn. We are dehumanizing them, making them feel that they are not capable. And I think that is what we can change through a carefully crafted curriculum and to rethink learning approaches that can enable greater justice, social equity, global solidarity, and democratic classrooms where everybody is given the expression to tell their stories and to feel accepted so that they can improve their own life chances in their lifetime. To my mind, it is also necessary to examine how ideologies that are casteist or racist, and the Northeast is full of that. The rest of the country does not have a very egalitarian perspective of the Northeast. We saw that in films like Chakte India. Today, of course, the hockey team has proved once again that people from Kerala, from Bihar, from Orissa, from Punjab can come together and play as a team and win an Olympic medal. And I think we need to understand that if this is our lived reality, then that means the normal citizen in our country is a peace-loving citizen. Now the challenge for us is to bring that lived reality into our classrooms through curriculum so that casteist, racist ideologies need not be perpetuated through the curriculum, but they should be challenged inside the curriculum and in the way we teach, so that we can bridge the ontological and epistemological gap, which actually is characteristic of formal knowledge, because knowledge is decontextualized. The moment we contextualize it, bring the lived realities of our students for engagement, we will bridge the ontological and epistemological gap, and we'll be able to question several epistemologies around contests like caste, gender, environment, and so on. And I'd like to now sort of get a little bit into the specifics about how do we see the impact of the consumerist lifestyle that we have created on this planet, because that is a question of environmental injustice, because there is an unequal distribution of resources, where America hogs up most of the world's resources. In India, the cities hog up most of the resources. Today, we know for sure that even during the pandemic, Adanis and Ambanis, who are the crony capitalists of New India that our political class has created, they have increased their wealth by 35% in the pandemic time, and the poorer people of our country and even the middle class have actually declined in their wages and income. And we know that about over 200 million people in our country have slipped into poverty. That means we have gone back 30 to 40 years. Now, why is this happening? It is happening because the pandemic has reminded us that the consumerist lifestyle that we developed on this planet is not only destroying the environment, but it is destroying civilization, because we are creating very, very wide and deep gaps between those who have and those who do not have. So this is a socio-ecological crisis. It's not just an ecological crisis where we see landslides happening in the mountains, the Kedarnath tragedy happened, the tsunamis happening, the floods of Bengal now, and the Madhya Pradesh floods. We see them happening not only here. The temperatures have soared in America, in Europe, and there are floods in the Netherlands and Germany. So we know that climate change has already happened, which means that this unequal society that we have created, economic inequality, social inequality, has actually led us not only to destroy our environment, but to destroy peace amongst the people who live on this earth. And therefore, the question that many critical scholars are asking is that this inequality is built into the core of modern culture. Should we not problematize the very idea of modernity? Should we not challenge this very idea of modernity? And in this context, I will wrap up in another 5 minutes that several theorists are questioning what is called Eurocentric universalism, which is only pushing towards individual development and not social goals of education. So we need to now recognize that these are imperfect worldviews. We need to bring changes. Self-critical intellectuals have continued to generate many other modes of thinking, and we need to look at the diversity of this thinking. Emerging alternative interpretation recognizes that the student is embedded in multiple relationships with the human and other than human world. And these relationships enable and catalyze the emergence of knowledge, and we need to recognize that. The point, therefore, is, can we reimagine a new post-humanist curriculum studies? One that deconstructs Western thought, but also one that calls the struggle against epistemicides. That means that we also challenge knowledge theories. We challenge epistemes, and we try and bring those epistemes that are more egalitarian and non-hegemonic, and not the Brahmanical kind that have dominated this part of the world, which means that we need to look at students and social movements that have been happening in our country across ages, look at the educational framework of critical pedagogy, feminist practice, because there we will find some very critical knowledges that we can bring into our curriculum, like climate, environmental justice cannot be achieved without tackling the social, racial injustices. So both will have to go together. In India, I believe that this is linked to a 2-century-long resistance to political and epistemic colonization, transcending the economic, the social, gender, environmental fragmentation, and the pandemic leaves behind will require a return to the inclusive, equal, fraternal founding vision of India as practiced and articulated by Ambedkar, Tagore, Sri Aurobindo, and Gandhi. Curriculum has typically been viewed as a tool for adapting education to society's needs. And in doing this, it has served to construct assumptions which are legitimized. But curriculum in India has been viewed as an act of deliberation rather than one based on intrinsic worth of knowledge. The current pandemic compels us to construct a relevant curriculum response and therefore to ask the question again, what knowledge has most worth? Post-humanism could be one way to bring together disparate critical approaches such as the feminist, anti-colonial, anti-caste, anti-racist, technology studies and ecologies, because this can help us to actually look at humanism, which has been restricted by politics earlier. These disparate theories have the potential to engage with intersectionality. That means, how does gender and caste work together? How does economic, educational inequality work together? Because this should be made central to curriculum design if we want to engage with the human as the problematique. A curriculum response to the stark realities of inequality and social injustice, which is made visible by the pandemic, will include cognizing the significance of subaltern disciplines, imagining transformative pedagogies, because only this will help us reclaim education spaces and sustain epistemic justice. Otherwise, according to NEP 2020, the politicians will tell us what to teach, how to teach, why to teach, not ourselves. We will lose ground as teachers, as faculty of universities about our own work. We will be alienated from our work. Let us get together and raise our voice that we know what best history to teach. The politician cannot tell us that. Therefore, the present pandemic health crisis implores us to rethink the meanings of education, the purposes of education, and how they can be woven in curriculum and pedagogic communication. So the most critical question that confronts us today is how we can engender a society that helps us reconnect with ourselves, with each other, and with the pluriverse, helps us overcome our fears, our insecurities that have made us passive and politically quiescent, help us develop a sense of solidarity, fraternity, and social justice with compassion and empathy, because these are the values we are committed to through the constitution that our forefathers had the vision to create. I think our curriculum dialogue needs to be situated in the constitution values of our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I request our participants to interact with ma'am regarding their questions and observations in these two sessions. Yes, please, you can unmute your microphone and ask your questions directly to ma'am. I will take up the questions after that from YouTube. Ma'am, in YouTube, Dr. Sudarshan Gogoi is asking how to correlate these concepts of analysis in analyzing the curriculums of natural science disciplines.
Yes. So I think I myself am not a person who comes from the sciences, but I think it's very important to revisit the way we look at science, traditionally, if I may point out just 2-3 factors that I've understood in my engagement with teachers who teach sciences, at least in the school level, is that our teaching of science is very laboratory based, but it is also not only laboratory based, it only validates what has already been discovered or invented. So we do not engage our students with inventing, with creating, with discovering per se. We are only engaging them with scientific experiments and activities, even through practicals, to validate the knowledge that already exists. So that has to change. Secondly, I feel that science needs to engage not only with science per se in terms of objective knowledge, but to understand the history of scientific development, the philosophy of science, so to speak. So I think when we bring in elements of the history and philosophy of science to engage our science students, then they will appreciate the fact that even science has exceptions, that science cannot be something that we call absolute objective knowledge, because all knowledges have subjective elements to those. The third thing I'd like to point is towards an interesting debate that you might find if you look at an article written by Professor Panchapakeshan in Current Science, where the debate actually is about the fact that we can develop scientific temper more by studying social sciences rather than by studying pure sciences. So think about these issues, because I think it's important if we want to develop scientific reasoning, which is now becoming, which is under attack now for some years. If we really want to develop that, then we have to bring in social science perspectives as much for our students to engage with, and not bring knowledges that exist in silos and which do not allow students to relate those to their own immediate and larger contexts.
The next question is from Dr. Zintu Gohai. Regarding modification of curriculum in social science, is there any definite approach which talks about the inclusion of changing dimensions of society?
I didn't get that question very well.
Zintu Gohai, are you there? Are you available with us? Is there any definite approach which talks about the inclusion of changing dimensions of society regarding modification of curriculum in social science?
Changing dimensions of society. Well, actually, sociology itself is about society. So that gives us a lot of interesting conceptual, theoretical perspectives in our own context. And there's enough decolonized knowledge within this discipline. And I would say that in any case, understanding changing aspects of society requires interdisciplinary engagement. It requires us to go back into our past as well, to understand how we have arrived at the present. And the problem with a lot of specializations is that we forget that knowledge gets generated at the intersections of disciplines. And I think the more we encourage interdisciplinary engagement, the better it would be. However, I must also say that every single social science within the rubric of social sciences, whether it's history, geography, political science, economics, has its own method of inquiry and its epistemological frame. So we cannot undermine those as well and only look at interdisciplinarity. So both will have to go hand in hand. And I think engaging with subjects of change is very critical, specifically in a historical perspective.
Ma'am Trishna Bhuya, she's asking what type of concepts to be incorporated in curriculum for achieving the goal of 21st century learners where curriculum is shifted from offline to virtual.
Yes, so, there is much hype about 21st century. I think it's all very good that we have technology that can take us into possibilities of breakout rooms on Zoom and be able to create small group discussions. But ultimately, technological platforms should be treated as something that supplements classroom teaching or real sort of, real settings of teaching. And I would hesitate to even look at online teaching and the skills required for online teaching as the core of education. I would like to undermine that because I feel that human contact and the discussions and the nuances that emerge from that individual contact and group contact is something we cannot achieve. For example, let's look at the question of diversity itself. How do we teach diversity on an online platform? I mean, can we rely simply on looking at written word and sharing some readings? Is it not important for us to share our lived experiences to understand diversity? And that becomes very difficult to do on online platforms. So 21st century skills have been hyped unnecessarily. We need them, but they cannot be treated as the core of education, because the core of education is to develop an agile mind, a mind that can absorb multiple perspectives and develop the discerning ability to gauge what would be appropriate at a given point in time, and to be able to sift robust reasoning from mere opinionated garbage, which is what is happening across, online platforms and in WhatsApp universities.
Arunima Boras is asking, what type of curriculum do you want to recommend for ongoing COVID situation for primary stage of education?
Okay. Well, at the primary stage, I think, imagine not letting children play, not letting children interact with each other, not letting children construct and deconstruct things on their own, because online doesn't allow any of that. So the very purposes of education are getting shifted. In fact, I would say the relevance of the meanings and the purposes of education are being sidelined. So at the primary level, I think we can do a lot of interesting storytelling stuff. We can help children to do things and to showcase them on an online platform, but we cannot once again look at the online as the means. Because I, as a teacher, if the children are shouting and screaming, I will just mute them. And how does that help them in learning? So I think the online platform, by its very nature, can become controlling and hegemonic. And that's not appropriate for an inclusive, democratic classroom, which is what a primary classroom and every other classroom should be like.
Yes, ma'am. Vipasha Roy has raised her hand. If you have any question.
Yes, ma'am. It was very enlightening discussion. So I have a question which is not this curriculum based, but I want to ask you that since history it has been shown that there were always people who could have impacted the curriculum the way you have discussed today, right? But they were never given a chance to design the curriculum. And now when we got an opportunity to redesign the curriculum like in this national education policy, if again the same thing happens, if we are not given the chance to design it properly, so what precautions we are going to take for that?
I think that's a very valid question. I would say that the NEP 2020 may be giving us a chance to rework and redesign curriculum, but if you read the policy carefully, it's actually moving towards a centralized way of designing curriculum. It's undermining the diversity of our country in designing curriculum. So it's actually pushing a governance structure that will regulate. There's going to be a national level curriculum body, even for higher education. That body will decide what will be taught sitting in Assam or in Mizoram or sitting in Bihar or down south in Kerala. So I think that is a very dangerous trend that the policy has already put in as a recommendation. My view is that unless educators themselves, like you and me, people who are in the business of teaching, people who are in universities, unless we collectively get together and claim that this is our space, that a historian will decide what history and how to teach it, that a geographer will decide what disciplinary knowledge is critical, not the politician, or not the curriculum national level body that does not look at diversity as the starting point of curriculum design. I think it will become too late if we do not wake up even now to assert our rightful space, because the university is the space of generating knowledge, and we should have a stake in deciding and designing curriculum along with the principles of diversity and social justice.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. So we have to basically start a movement again.
Absolutely. I think the work of democracy can never be over. In fact, at different points of time in history, the work of democracy becomes even more difficult because democracy is a work in progress. And right now it is at stake. And I think educators have to play a very critical role in coming together. Let's stop behaving like individual people. Let us start and develop collectives where we can raise our voice. There are already many forums that are doing that. And I think we have a role to play over there.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, thank you, ma'am.
What type of curriculum design is necessary to educate the common people outside the classroom? Pompi Body is asking.
The common people outside the classroom. Yeah, I had referred to this. Actually, Ambedkar was one of the key things, and we have a tradition in India. I mean, let's go back to the Bhakti age. Let's go back to Kabir, right? So Kabir used to just sit in a mohalla and start singing, right? And a lot of people would get together and get that wisdom from what he was trying to say when he tried to say that there is one God and that every other religion is actually giving us a similar message. The point is that in India, entire subcontinent of this country has an amazing tradition of public education. Education where we actually have been teaching each other for generations without the four walls of a classroom. I think we need to revive traditions like this. Why can't we organize little public sabhas where we actually talk about some of the most critical aspects? Let's say during the pandemic, we saw these ugly scenes of so many dead bodies floating around the Ganga, right from Madhya Pradesh, UP to Bihar and so on. Why couldn't we talk about it? In my own colony, could I organize a little half an hour, 45 minutes talk around that? And as concerned citizens, can we put it out as a letter to the editor? Can I put it out and give it somewhere, maybe create a little sort of a local newspaper around a particular part of the city or the village or the cluster of villages where I belong? Is it possible to do that? We can think, we can imagine some such ways of actually educating people by way of enabling forums of interaction around most burning issues which worry us, which concern us, which can include the beautiful celebration of the hockey bronze medal. I mean, it doesn't have to be sad stories or tragic stories. or stories of injustices. There can also be stories of justice. There can also be stories of celebration. But could we do that in our small little ways all across the country, in villages, mohallas, cities, mega cities, wherever we are, wherever we can? Because small groups can actually do that at small levels, but there can be a network of such ideas across the country. We don't have to centralize these ideas, just like the government is trying to centralize everything.
That's a very insightful idea, ma'am. Rupam Goswami, I can understand from the lecture that philosophy towards learning, acquiring skill is equally important. Is this aspect lacking in modern education of India, although we have seen efforts?
What aspect?
He's talking about the philosophy towards learning, acquiring skill is equally important, but that philosophy is lacking.
Yes, I think we do need to. That's a very good question, because we have also been overwhelmed by a very Western laboratory-based school of thinking around what learning is and how learning happens. In India, again, we have traditions and traditions of learning. When a particular potter's child sits and observes her father or her mother develop pottery, that is a form of learning. Craft in India has been taught like that, through informal methods. We need to learn from these methods and bring some of them to our formal spaces. We need to break those boundaries and consider formal education something that needs to be reimagined, that can bring in traditional ways of looking at learning. Many ideas were given to us through Gandhi, through Tagore, through Sri Aurobindo, through Vivekananda, but I think we need to revisit those ideas and make them more adaptable to the current situation, because we've got stuck in a certain mold of learning, and as if learning is an individual activity. To my mind, learning is a social activity. It requires exchange of ideas, exchange of views. It requires teamwork. Now, traditionally in a school setting or a higher education setting, we look at learning as an individual activity, and we keep telling, don't talk to each other, don't interact with each other, which is the most ridiculous thing to do, because we learn from each other. Even when I'm reading a good article, I'm learning from the author's ideas that she may have collated from dozens of readings that she has done and her own life experiences, and brought them to articulate to a particular area of focus. So I think we do need to rethink and reimagine. So what India suffers from is a poverty of imagination, I think. We need to release ourselves from the shackles of formal knowledges that have straitjacketed us to think only in tunnel vision ways. And we need to expand and look at our own. Somebody is mentioning indigenous knowledges, and I completely agree. And that is where epistemic injustice can be overcome if we bring indigenous knowledges to bear on our formal knowledges. So, for example, there's a lot of science in Ayurveda. There's a lot of science in, an understanding of the local building materials, for example. There's so much out there in our context. And there are professional groups who've been drawing upon these indigenous knowledges and bringing it into the formal courses of architectural design, urban planning, or even medicine. And I think we need to open ourselves to making sense of these indigenous knowledges, but to not make it a fetish, because the fetish right now is there's only knowledge which is Indian. And, we've given everything to the world. I mean, cosmetic surgery of the Ganesh or any such thing. Let's shy away from that, because that is dangerous territory. It is taking us to the point of ultimate irrationality and undermining reason. No, we cannot afford to do that. But indigeneity of living, experience of living, indigenous knowledge systems, yes, there is enough scope to research with reason, with robust research methods, and bring it into our formal systems of education.
I think that was rightly pointed out by our participant also. Pallavi is adding that I want your opinion on adding more to it, like race and indigenous knowledge that you just talked about as further entry points, specifically locating the course in Northeast region in India.
Absolutely. There's a mine of lived experience and wisdom which we need to bring in from all across the country, and the Northeast certainly is one such space. And I must say I'm very pained at the recent clashes that have happened between Assam and Mizoram, and I'm hoping that good sense will prevail and this will not be politicized. But this is a point, I would say, that is burning and needs to be brought into our curriculum discourse. We can't shut our eyes to what is happening around us. And a deliberative curriculum means exactly that. Bring in the most relevant issues that strike us and are living right now into the classroom.
Yes, in terms of classroom, many faculty, most of the faculty are now worried about the pandemic situation. So they have their opinions and observations and questions also regarding that this modern education system cannot replace the classroom learning. But is there any need or necessity to change the curriculum to cope up with pandemic situation? They have their mind this question. Well, if the situation will go long time, keeping in mind all the parameters you have said in your lecture, so is there any need to prepare separate curriculum for normal situation and for pandemic situations?
I don't think we should polarize like that. What we should do is, as I tried to communicate, that given the pandemic, we have been able to see, look at the inequalities and injustices in our society in a more visible manner, because the pandemic has just brought it in front of us, right? Whether we saw the migrants walking back, whether we saw the kind of deaths during coronavirus, the apathy of the system, the lack of health care, and even now in Parliament, people are saying, no, there were no deaths without oxygen. So it's crazy, absolutely. I think when these kind of situations emerge, the pandemic is trying to tell us that it's time for us to pause and think whether what we are teaching in the name of curriculum in our different disciplines in higher education, even in school education, whether it's really worth that knowledge, whether we should rethink that knowledge. Can we try and use our constitution as a frame which talks of fraternity, equality, liberty, justice? Can we bring those values into our teaching, looking at social science knowledge, languages, humanities, whatever it may be? Is it possible to weave in aspects into our curriculum so that our students don't only become certified professionals or certified graduates, but they also become active citizens who can raise questions around their own rights and the rights of others? And I think that is the purpose, the real purpose of education, to question what there is, to be able to change the situation on the ground. We cannot wave a magic wand, but we can develop citizens who are alert, and who are alert to the rights and the duties that they both have in the Constitution. Is it not possible for us to redesign curriculum to achieve that purpose? Because I'm very sure that many of us sitting here would be thinking that many of us have gone through education ourselves. Some of us have taught for a long time, some not for such a long time, but we have all faced the dilemma of how to relate